Okay, shalom, shavua tov, boker tov. We speak today, Bezat Hashem, a second installment, a second part on Reb Moshe Feinstein.
Yes. No, it's on today.
And we remember that last week you spoke about his birth in 1895 in what is nowadays Belarus. Then it was part of the Russian Empire. And he's born to a very important rabbinical family, and he's learning and he's excellent. And he becomes a Rav at a very young age, still unmarried. And already his name is well known. Not only people ask him questions, but rabbis from the area in Eastern Europe begin to send questions to him in a very young age. However, at 1937, when he's about 40, he discovers that he cannot stay in Russia and hope to be able to continue and teach Torah there and give halacha there. It's obvious that the communist government, and more specifically the Yevsektia, these are the Jews that were responsible, the Jewish section, that they target him personally because they knew that he was a leading figure, and they didn't let him even teach his children. At that point, he understands that time had come that he has to leave, which obviously immediately after was, I mean, he did it in order to continue and teach Torah and learn Torah, but obviously it was also the best choice from the point of view of just saving his life. So in 1937, after a small journey through Europe, through Riga, in Latvia and other places, he's able to secure a visa and lands on the shores of the United States of America. And again, it took some time, but not very long before he had found his place in the Lower East Side, heading the yeshiva, which is called the Metivsa of Tiferet Yerushalayim, where he stayed, excuse me, to his last day. Obviously, when he came to America, he had what we can call a culture shock. I think it's clear, and I just want to share with you one interesting quote, which is an example to this culture shock. So if you can please move these pages around. Okay. So the first source, that is from a drasha he gave shortly after coming to America, 1943. So 6 years after reaching the shores, and he is giving a drasha in a bar mitzvah, and he speaks about Avraham Avinu, and he says that the ma'ala, the special feature, the unique characteristic of Avraham Avinu was שהיה רק יחיד בעולם שהכיר האמת. He was the only one that knew the truth. All the world from one side and Avraham Avinu at the other side. And Rambam says that Avraham Avinu understood that everyone, so Avraham Avinu sat down and thought about how can it be that God would be a stone and a wood, and then he came to the conclusion that God must be beyond all of these. And Rambam says, and then he knew that everyone is wrong and he is right. And I always say that that is the minute in which the first Jew was born. So he knew that everyone is wrong and only he is right. So that is Avraham Avinu. But it is very lonely. And לא נתבייש, and אברהם אבינו did not shy away from the truth that was revealed to him. ולא נתייאש שיחזיקו לשויטה, he was not afraid that he would be seen as a fool. And then Moshe says, בזמן הזה בעוונותינו הרבים, excuse me, בזמן הזה בעוונותינו הרבים, שגלינו כל אחד מעיר של יראי השם למדינה הזאת. So you maybe expect גלינו מארצנו, right? We were exiled from our land. It says, no, we were exiled from our cities in the old country in which the people were יראי השם. Now, we have to remember, the people in the old country in the 30s were not so יראי השם. We just saw his answers. Himself, he was giving tshuvot responsa in Europe and gave answers to people that are being hosted by their children who are not observant anymore. So the situation was not so good at Eastern Europe. But you know how looking back at something sometimes can look different than when it happens. And also in 1943, the people in Europe are being they are being targeted and killed and murdered and slaughtered. So obviously he's now looking at them as martyrs. And he says, גלינו כל אחד מעיר של יראי השם. So we were exiled from the cities of the God-fearing people, למדינה הזאת. But now we came to this Medina, the golden Medina. Right? We came to the United States. בין תושבים רחוקים מהשם ומתורתו. So the people here are far removed from God and from his Torah. Maybe you would say, okay, so sit alone in some cave. He says, no, אפשר להיות בדד. You cannot be alone. שבאין אצלו, ומוכרח להתערב בכל ענייני העולם. People come, and you need to get engaged in all matters of worldly matters. וללמוד כל לימודיהם וכדומה. And you need to go to college maybe, and Moshe about going to college, that's a long answer, but you need to study for your parnasa, to make a living. כל לימודיהם, לכן אין עצה אחרת, אלא להיות כמעלת אברהם. So there is no other choice, there is no other עצה, he says, but to be as Avraham Avinu, that just as he was the only tzaddik, but he held steady to his truth, ולא השגיח על כל אנשי העולם, and he was not moved by the rest of the people of the world, and that is בכך חותמים מגן אברהם. So the young שמל קיבל בר מצווה, right, so should he be התחזק להיות צדיק, אף שישאר יחיד בעירו. He says, I know, it's amazing, that's a bracha to בר מצווה. I know you'd remain lonely among your city and among your friends and among your members, your neighbors. But I wish you, now we do not know, I do not know. It would be so interesting to know if his bracha was fulfilled. I don't know. I don't know where the bracha was given. It's quoted in his Darash Moshe. That's a 2-volume set of drashot that Reb Moshe gave. And they quote it as a drashat bar mitzvah. They give the date. But I don't think that the name of the boy is there. And even if it is, it will be very difficult to track him down. But Reb Moshe sees 1943, and that's what he has to say on a bar mitzvah, that the boy would probably remain observant lonely. I mean, hopefully he would remain observant. But if he would remain observant, he would be lonely. Another tshuva that he gave many years later, that's here in source bet, but it's a tshuva from 1979, I think. 1979. So it's in old age. And he was asked to give guidelines for chinuch, for education. So a very interesting tshuva, very interesting, many interesting aspects. One I would quote here, and if God would give us help and health, then I would give another aspect from this tshuva later in this shiur. So says Reb Moshe, source bit, והנה במדינתנו, in our state, מרוב הברכה שנתן השם יתברך, so because of all of these blessings that were bestowed by God, יש רצון ותאווה גדולה להנאות העולם הזה. He says, people here are so materialistic. And why is that? Because of all of the goods that were bestowed upon them. Because if you have nothing, then you do not, if there is nothing that drive you to desire for, then you do not desire. Because there is nothing to care. However, if there are so many blessings, then as they say, you begin to count them. And then you want more. So, יש רצון ותאווה גדולה להנאות העולם הזה בכל התענוגים שקוראים לזה good time. People call it good time. שגם זה דבר המקלקל את האדם מאוד. He says that is something that really ruins man. שמרגיל את יצרו להתאבות לדברים שאין צורך בהם. So you are getting used to enjoy things that really are completely unnecessary. הוא משחית את מידותיו, and that destroys your character. עד שנהפך לחיה רעה, and a man becomes an animal. Why? Because in the beginning, he wants to receive what he got used to all of these pleasures. So in the beginning, he may try to acquire them in at least half decent ways. However, כשאי אפשר, when he sees that half decent won't do the work, then he goes completely indecent. לא יימנע אף באיסור, עד שלהצדיק מעשיו נעשה לכופר חס וחלילה. וכמאמרם לא עבדו ישראל עבודה זרה אלא להתיר עריות. So just as the עגל, חז"ל say, how can עם ישראל worship the golden calf? 40 days before they had מעמד הר סיני. So one of the answers, not the only one, but one of the answers given by Chazal is that Am Israel didn't really believe that the golden calf is God. But if you believe in the golden calf, there are many things you are allowed to do. You are not allowed to do if you believe in God. So you make your choice. And people sometimes prefer to subscribe to something they do not really believe in, but they want to gain the benefits, the physical benefits, the pleasures. And he says that is what's happening to us here. He says התורה הקפידה על כך מאוד, בעיקר בחינוך הילדים. So especially when you deal with education of children, you need to make sure that they should not be too spoiled. Because if they are being spoiled with leisure, with pleasure, with these worldly things, then you teach them that that's what they should aspire to, and that is what they should pursue. Because if they got used that in their parents' home, they get X, Y, I don't want to give details, so in order not to embarrass yourself or myself. But if they get used that in their parents' home, they get A, B, and C, and then they are 25, 26, they get married, Baruch Hashem, and suddenly they cannot provide A, B, and C. So, good case scenario maybe is that they would go to ask their parents to give them some gifts, which is not necessarily the best thing that happened, but that is the least worst thing. Because what may also happen is that they would try to get money quick, right? Because they need to keep the level of life they were used to. And when you are trying to become rich quick, then all the pitfalls of the world are just waiting for you. So he says, שזה יביא אותו לבסוף להיות ליסטים, רוצח, כופר בכל התורה. Oh, he's very sharp. He says they would become robbers, thieves, they would become murderers, and they would become אפיקורסים, they would be heretics in all the Torah. וגם על זה צריכים המורים להשגיח וללמד לתלמידים איך להתנהג ולדבר עמהם. So the teacher must always speak with their children, with the students, בגנות בעלי התאווה, so against the desires and those that have the desires, ובשבח הנאה ממעשים טובים שהוא הנאה עולמית. It says, you also need to know how to market in America. You need to say to them, you know what is the real pleasure? The real happiness is in Torah. So if people are looking for pleasures, try to present the Torah in a way that would also speak to. Now, obviously, in the end, you cannot compete with some of the bodily pleasures that are in the street. The students must decide that he wants to choose the way of Torah. But Reb Moshe says we must make sure that at least we are playing on an even field. Because if we are getting our children used to bodily pleasures, it will be extremely difficult for them to disconnect themselves and only attend to their spiritual needs. So that's, I think, a very sobering answer. They say that he insisted on reading every morning the Morgen Journal, which was the Yiddish Jewish newspaper. Now, it was not very firm. And his son-in-law, Rav Tendler, asked him, "Why do you need to read this in his writing? This is the Chayzerai." Oh, what? Chayzerai. Yeah. He said, why do you need this garbage? Why? You're Moshe Feinstein. Every minute of your time is diamonds. So why would you read such a newspaper? And Reb Moshe says, I need to know what is happening in the world. And if what is happening in the world, that I add, if what is happening in the world is also garbage, then yes, I need to know what garbage is in the world because I give psakim to the people living there outside. I cannot sit in my yeshiva and give halacha to the people outside if I am not connected and aware to what is going on outside the walls of my yeshiva. And in that, Rav Moshe, I think, was a very special, a very unique position, had a very unique position as a posek. Because we know that there are two types of poskim usually. There are the community rabbis, who are very connected to their community and to their people, and they answer from this position of connectiveness to their community. And there are the Rashi Yeshiva poskim, who are connected to the Torah and give their psika from a little high above. So they usually say, it's not completely 100% correct, but as a prototype, they said that Aruch HaShulchan, Reb Yechiel Epstein, he was a community rabbi, and the Chafetz Chaim was the prototype of the Rosh Yeshiva rabbi. Now, the Chafetz Chaim was also the Rav of Radin, so it is not completely correct, but that's usually how they mark it. Now, Reb Moshe was a combination because for almost 30 years, 20 years, he was a community rabbi. So he knew how to be a community rabbi. He was ingrained in that. His father was a community rabbi. On the other hand, when he came to the United States, very interestingly, he did not establish a community. He had a shul, people came in, but it was not a community. So he was a Rosh Yeshiva. He had this both in him. He was extremely very connected to the Torah and to psika and to analytical thought, but he was also very connected to the people. And from being able to hold to these two end of the rope, I would say, that gave him the ability to see things that others may have missed. 1939, 2 years after he came to the United States, there is a celebration. Why? Because they celebrate in the United States back then 150 years to the Constitution. Now, let's say that in 10 years from now, 15 years from now, they would celebrate 250 years to the Constitution. How many rabbis in the United States from the Haredi community, such as Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, do you know that would give a drasha about the American Constitution? There are more people here that know the material than what I know, but I have this impression that not many.
Like when the mayor came.
If the mayor would come, yeah. For the Goyim, they would give a drasha. Yeah, for the Goyim, they would give a drasha, but not for their own people. Moshe Feinstein, only 2 years after coming, decides to give a drasha on the Constitution of the United States. Amazing. But why? For a very good reason. He has a very good point to compare to. He comes from communist Russia. And he wants to make the comparison. Now it's 1939, so the Nazis are also on the rise in Germany. No one still dreams about what would happen. But the Nazis are a fascist regime. And he wants to make a comparison between the communist and the fascist regimes and the democracy of the United States. So look at source Gimel. And that is from his drasha. הנה כל אמון התפלה שבעולם. So every superstition in the world, כל שיטה הבלית שבעולם, and every stupid ism, right, in the world, אומרת שהיא מאירה בעולם. They all claim that they are the light to the nations. Obviously, he refers here to Stalin, right? The sun to the nations. So everyone says שהיא מאירה בעולם. ומציירת איזה דברים יפים, לאחוז העיניים ולצודד הנפשות. So they draw beautiful depictions to catch the eye, ולצודד הנפשות. אבל מאחר שהרבה אין רוצים בזה, but what to do that many people are not interested in your ideology. So then what they do? או כופים בחרב ובחנית. So they force their ideology with the sword and with the spear. They may have began with speaking about beautiful things and now we would all live together in happiness and in harmony. But in order to reach that, first you need to use the sword and the spear. But in the minute you begin to use the sword and the spear, then you discover that it is much easier to control with the sword and the spear than to try and give back the control, the government to the people. And he says, בין בזמן העבר, בין בזמן הזה, ועוד ביתר שאת. So that is true to the past, that is true to the present. And even more, כמו ממשלת רוסלנד, so that is Russia, וממשלת אשכנז, that is Germany. וכדומה. וזהו הפסולת שבמאור שלהם. So they have these visions of light, but there is a big darkness in their vision of light. ויצא סופו שנשאר רק הרשעות לבדו. And in the end, the light fades away, and you remain only with the evil. והמאור נכבה לגמרי, כמו שראינו בעינינו ברוסלנד. So he says, I saw it with my own eyes, that in the beginning they made a revolution and they really had light in their eyes. People really believed that they are bringing redemptions with their own hands. But they only brought the government of Stalin. It is sad, it is tragic. I think that looking back, maybe we can think that they were wrong and to understand where their mistakes were. But we can also have some sympathy towards some of these people that really fought and maybe gave their life for what they believed is the bettering of the human species, race. But instead, what they brought was one of the most murderous regimes that this planet ever knew. And he says, לבסוף יישאר רק הכוח, ולא השיטה. The ideology is being thrown away and only bare power remains. ויהיה חורבן בעולם. That brings destruction. היוצא מזה שכל מלכות מאומות העולם אינה רשאה לתפוס בשיטה אחת, אלא רק צריכה להשגיח שלא יעשו עוול אחד כנגד חברו. So amazing. Moshe Feinstein is John Stuart Mill. He says, we learn from here that what the government should do is not to hold on to some specific shita, some specific ideology that you force on the people. You should limit yourself only to make sure that people do not harm each other. That is the conclusion of Moshe Feinstein from his own adventures in Russia. And he says, לעניין שיטות ואמונות דברים, יהיה כל אחד חופשי לעשות מה שרוצה. He says, freedom of religion is excellent. Everyone should have the ability to do whatever he pleases. והמלכות תשגיח רק שלא יבלעו אחד את חברו. So the only thing that the kingdom, that the government should do is make sure that people do not swallow each other. ואם כן מלכות ארצות הברית, so this kingdom of the United States of America, that 150 years ago, they already foresaw what can happen. And they set the law with their kingship, שלא יחזיקו שום אמונה ושיטה. So the government said, we do not hold to any faith or belief system. And we leave it to the people to do as they understand. He says, די הרי הם עושים כרצון השם יתברך. It's amazing. He says, the government of the United States is doing the will of God. And the Constitution, the American Constitution, is the equivalent or appropriate to the will of God. I think again, this is astounding. וכן הצליחו ונתגדלו במשך הזמן הזה, and he says, you see, they became very successful. ומחויבים אנו להתפלל בעדם, and we must pray for them, for the American government, שהשם יתברך ויצליחם בכל אשר יפנו. God would bless them with success everywhere they go to, ובקרוב יבשה יהודה וישראל, and עם ישראל would get his own redemption, amen. So that's the drasha by Moshe Feinstein on the occasion of 150 years for the United States Constitution. Now, it's not only drashot. There are halachic consequences to this approach. So a few, let's see one of them. Source Dalet. Now, unfortunately, there is no date on this tshuva, so I don't know what from when it is. I would guess it's around the 60s. That's a guess. הנה בדבר ענייני החסד, אשר הממשלה שלנו ארצות הברית שבאמריקה. So he says, I want to speak about the ענייני חסד, the charity issues, that our government, that's such a, even these are small words, but so interesting, הממשלה שלנו, our government, שארצות הברית שבאמריקה, שהשם יתברך ברחמיו המרובים על שארית הפליטה מיהודי כל מדינות יורופ, ושארית גדולי התורה ותלמידיהם הביאנו לכאן. So God in his mercy brought those that remained from the Holocaust. In Europe, he brought us here. ונוסדו מקומות התורה ישנים שם יורופ. And ברוך השם, we were able to re-establish some of the yeshivot from Europe, and also גם חדשים, there are new yeshivot that were established in the United States. ועל ידי שמלכות של חסד. So this is a kingship, the United States is a kingship of חסד, of kindness. שכל מטרתה הוא להיטיב לכל תושבי המדינה, and the government only think about how to improve and to make better the life of the people. המציאה כמה עניינים של פרגרמן, that's programs. So they invented some programs לעזור לתלמידים שבכל בתי הספר שבמדינה, שיוכלו ללמוד ולהתגדל בלימודם. So they give, basically they fund. They give money for students in yeshivot, not only in yeshivot, in every registered high school or higher education, you can get, depends on many criteria, but you can get money for the students that learn by you. So you can easily understand what would be the question that you was asked. If you get money according to the number of students you have, then obviously you'd gain more if you'll have more students. Now, if you can attract more students, that's beautiful. But what happens if you cannot attract more students? Maybe you're allowed to register more people. It's for the sake of Torah, right? Because you'd have more money. It either goes to the yeshiva or it would go to the Catholic school, right, across the road. So we are taking the money from the Christians and we put it into yeshiva for Torah learning. What can be more beautiful than that? You understand, that's not what I... Right? Okay. Says Moshe, ודאי כל ראשי הישיבות והמנהלים והתלמידים מכירים בכל טובות המדינה. So first, let's make sure, ודאי, כל ראשי הישיבות, so all the ראשי ישיבות, והמנהלים, and the principals, והתלמידים, and the students, must all express their gratitude, מכירים בכל טובות המדינה. That's in itself. Again, these are sentences that, we speak here about the United States, would may have been a hope that it would also be, right, it would be said here. So all of the yeshivot, all of the heads of the yeshivot, all of the rabbis, all of the students, they all first must acknowledge the benefits that they are being given. ומברכים לשלום המדינה. And they should make a bracha, tefillah, for the peace, for the sake of the land. ולכל העומדים בראשה, and for all of the government. ובכל, every blessing. אבל ודאי אנחנו מוזרים מהשם יתברך שציוונו בתורתו הקדושה להיזהר מלקח יותר מכפי שתנאי הממשלה קבעו. So we must, for sure, he says, we must abstain from taking more than what the government is willing to give us. אף שיכולים להשיג יותר מאיזה פקידים, and maybe you can bribe your way, you can speak with some functionary and give you more and do things behind the back. That is not the way that Torah observant Jews conduct themselves. You do not go behind the back, even if there is some functionary in some office that you can connect to, and that way gain a few more cents. It doesn't worth the corruption of your own moral character. וכל שכן שאסור לשקר במספר התלמידים. And he says, and I don't even speak about lying outright about the number of the students. מצאנו לנכון לעורר בזה כדי להשגיח ביותר גם על המתנדבים. He says, I don't speak only for the principals and the Rashi Yeshiva, which says, obviously they are תלמידי חכמים, no way that they would cheat. But even the people that contribute money to the yeshiva. And maybe there are some monkey business, you know, you donate, you get your tax receipt, and then you get also some of the money back. I'm sure you never heard about such things, but you should know that in other religions, sometimes they do that. And Moshe says, I also want to warn the donors that they must not use the yeshivot, excuse me for the language, to launder money. שמביאים נדבותיהם להחזקת התורה שלא יגרמו גזל, so they should not cause thievery, והפסד ממון למדינה שלא כדיני התורה ודיני הממשלה. You must keep the law of Torah and the law of the land, שלא ייכשלו אף שלא מדעת בחטאים הגדולים האלו. These are grave sins, ולכל הנזהרים ביותר תבוא עליהם ברכת טוב. So people that are careful with that, then the blessing of good should come on them, ויצליחו, they'll be successful, מוסדות התורה, להרבות תלמידים יראי שמיים. And it says, אשרו ברכה גדולה גם למדינה. And also, by the way, we also contribute to the state. Why? Because our students, if we would raise them to be faithful, straight, people that are observant in בין אדם למקום, אין בין אדם לחברו, then this is a great blessing to the state, כאשר ידוע ומפורסם לכל, אשר תלמידי הישיבות הם המובחרים ברוך השם מהאזרחים במידותיהם ובמעשיהם הטובות. So as is known to everyone that the yeshiva students are the best citizens there are, and you know, from time to time you do hear, and it's warming the heart, right? You hear about this yeshiva student that found a large sum of money and gave it back in the train, right? In the underground train. And then from time to time, these stories are being, I think they are really beautiful stories. And of course, we need to do our best for it to be the way that people perceive yeshiva students, and not only yeshiva students, the Jews and Torah. Now, there are anti-Semitics, obviously, that nothing would help to change their mind, and we do not care, if you'd excuse me, about their mind. But we have the normal so-called people, which are, in the end, they see their neighbor, they see someone across the street, they read the newspaper headline, and from there, they somehow form an opinion regarding Torah, regarding Yahadut, and we need to make sure that these people would get a good impression. Okay, so that's the tshuva by the Igot Moshe regarding the American government. Another, we would not read inside, but another responsa that are relevant to his, I don't know how to say, but to his acknowledgement of the great good that is in the United States government, the whole hater, the leniency in stam chalav, in the milk of the companies. What is it based upon? It's based upon his faith in the FDA. He has faith that the Americans, when they give their stamp on the milk. So if the American government is giving their stamp that milk is made of cow and nothing else, he says you can rely on that. In Russia, I couldn't rely on that, and that's why I needed a Jew every place where they milk a cow. But in the United States, I can rely on that. Now, I'm not going right now into the question, did he think that it's a lechatchila? Did he think that only when you do not have a chalav Israel, you can rely on it? There are different answers and different traditions, and that's not our topic right now. But the basic allowance here, the basic leniency, is based upon this notion that the United States government is an institution that is by the people and for the people. There are other areas in which he opposed too much of Americanization. Because obviously, as we saw in the beginning, he was very worried about the materialism and other bad influences that may come when someone is getting too much acculturated into the United States general population. And so he opposed, in a sense, and again, there are different answers here, and while he was still alive, he was asked about contradictions in his response. But he more or less opposed Thanksgiving celebrations if they are being done in a kavua way. Yeah, I apologize. Not worried, there are other rabbis that thought it's fine. but Moshe Feinstein thought that doing it every year that comes out of the will to be as the non-Jews, to be similar to the non-Jews, and that is so as an issue. Again, there are different responses here with different.
He's supposed to do Thanksgiving.
Yeah, but not. Yeah, but not on their day. In my own day, because you don't want to completely get acculturated, assimilated. Yes, he was asked about closing the schools on Sundays. He says, Chash v'chas v'chalila, part of the bitul Torah that is involved, then why? Because the Goyim, the non-Jews close on Sunday, so we close on Sunday. In Europe, they would close on Sunday for 1,000 years. No one dreamt to close the yeshivot in Europe on Sundays. So why they should be closed in the United States? I'll just tell you a story. When we went to Shlichut in Toronto, in Canada. So on the first Sunday that we were there, we landed somewhere in the middle of the week. Then there was Shabbat, and then there was Sunday. And I came to the shul at the regular time for the early minyan, and the place is closed. No early minyans on Sunday. And then I discovered that also the general assumption between the learners in the kollel was that there is no learning on Sunday. So Baruch Hashem, we changed this setting very fast. There still was a difference, by the way, because we learned only at the morning, and they were required at night to go to shuls and sit there. But the afternoon, I was not able to convince them to sit in the kollel. So that's it is interesting, and it seems that there is I think it's clear that there was much more Americanization in the United States, that there was Europeization in Europe throughout all of the Middle Ages, and the reason is clear, because in Europe throughout the Middle Ages the Jews were hated. So why would they assimilate into a surrounding that hates them? But in the minute that you do not meet with hatred, but just with, no, here everyone is unique, so everyone is doing whatever he wants, then many of the boundaries against assimilation falls down. All the boundaries from the other side do not exist anymore. You must build all the walls by yourself. So this was a question, this was a balance I think he was dealing with throughout all of his life. 1946, he prints his first sefer. His first sefer is not the Igot Moshe. His first sefer is Dibrot Moshe, which is his chidushim on the Shas. He printed quite a handful of these. They are extremely long, extremely difficult. He saw them as his masterpiece. It's very interesting. He saw them as his masterpiece. And he writes in the beginning of the sefer that the Dibrot Moshe, in the introduction, he says, I think that if someone can teach 50 students in his yeshiva, but then he can print a sefer and 100 students would learn, then that's a mitzvah of lehafitz Torah, of expanding Torah, and of course you should do that. And later they say, there is a story, a legend if you want. They say that someone once told him that the Igot Moshe was sold in so and so copies, very large number. And he said, I would have given this number if you'd give me half this number for the Dibrot Moshe. He really wanted his Dibrot Moshe to be acknowledged. Unfortunately, it's a very, very difficult book. It's very long. And just truth is just very long. The language is difficult. And I don't think it's being learned too much, even in yeshivot. The Dibrot Moshe. It's very interesting because the Igot Moshe, of course, is maybe easily one of the 5 most important forum of the 20th century. But the Dibrot Moshe is hardly being opened. Very interesting by itself. But he saw himself as a Rosh Yeshiva. He was teaching yeshiva students for years and years. And he would give shiur every day to shiurim in the yeshiva, and every Friday would give every Friday would be a 3 hours shiur, very long. These Friday shiurim later became the Dibrot Moshe. So that is 1946. 1959, much later, comes the first volume of the Igot Moshe. And again, he was not a community rav, and all his stature as a Posek just came from the fact that people trusted him, asked him questions, and followed him. And he did not apply to any job, the Posek of America. It was just made by, and not by, nowadays there are newspapers that are, this is their job to make who is the Posek right now. But back then, it was just people knew that he is the leading authority. He had a special gift of memory. I mean, not only memory, he learned, that's what they say, he learned every day 2 prakim of Tanakh, 7 dapim of Shas, Talmud Bavli, and I can't remember, I guess a few simanim in Shulchan Aruch. So he was finishing the Shas and the Tanakh every year, and the Shulchan Aruch every 2 years, and that gives you a command over the areas of halacha. And he was giving answers. He could give immediate answers. People would phone him, and he would give you an answer immediately. And people would come to him. They say, again, some of people here may have davened in his shul. I unfortunately didn't have the privilege, but they say that people would come at Shachrit. They would daven Shachrit, and then after the tefillah, they would form a long line, and the Moshe would just give answers, and he would give. Now, of course, an aguna question. We all understand that he won't give a psak on the way, but most of the questions are not aguna questions, and he would just paskin them one after the other. That's pretty amazing, and that is from someone. I mean, unfortunately, there may be some people who give this type of answers because they don't really care, or they have too much of a high appreciation of themselves. Moshe Feinstein was very far from that. He was an extremely humble man. As a matter of fact, after my last shiur, some few came to me after the shiur, and they said to me, which is very important, they said, you must not forget, when you speak about Moshe Feinstein, don't forget his humbleness. Because a part of his Torah greatness and the tshuvot and the psakim and everything that we speak here about, for everyone that saw him even for a short time, what was really glaring was his humbleness. He was a small man in stature. He was really a small man, and he felt himself small, not because he was, but because he was humble. But he was great. So it was greatness in a small package. And one beautiful story. Again, these are stories. You all know that stories are stories. But as they always say, they don't tell these stories about me. So there is a story that when he was already, I guess that would be in the 70s, he was very old, already sick. And he had a doctor. And the doctor, I already read 2 or 3 versions of the same story. But let's say for the sake of the story, in order to make it simple, that he had a doctor, and the doctor had a secretary, an older secretary. And the secretary, when she saw Moshe Feinstein, she approached him. Well, she was, I guess, a simple woman, and she gave him a kiss on the cheek. And there was a nephew there, if I remember the story correctly, and he was already a Shiva Bucher, and he was he was terrified. And he came to Reb Moshe and he began to apologize. My aunt, she's a simple woman, she doesn't know, she doesn't. And Reb Moshe said, you saw that she has a number on the head. She's more saintly than you or me. That's an answer. That's an answer to Gadol B'Israel. So that's only one story, and there are many, many more stories like that. There is a story about, again, there are different versions here, but I will take one of them. After his ptira, his children were sitting shiva. His boys were sitting shiva. His children were sitting shiva, and suddenly the phone rings on Friday, and one of them picks up the phone, and there is a woman on the other side of the phone, and she says, "Can I get the Rav?" And she says to her, "Unfortunately, the Rav was niftar, and maybe I can help you." And she says to him, "I was phoning the Rav every Erev Shabbat for the last 20 or 30 years." There are different versions. Just to ask, and I want to know when does Shabbat enter? Now, someone like Rav Moshe, right, that every second of his time was counted. But he never said to her, "No, just look at the calendar." Okay, if she is calling me in order to ask when Shabbat enters, I give her an answer. If she calls the next Shabbat, and by the way, maybe she needs a connection with her Rav, and she doesn't know how to express herself, and that's her connection. Beautiful. There was another almana, widow of a certain Rav that was niftar, and Rav Moshe would call her every Motzei Shabbat and would do the Havdalah over the phone. We know that because there is a response in which he deals with the question, can you do Havdalah over the phone? He rules that yes. And from there we know the story that there was this widow that he would call every week, every Motzei Shabbat, in order to let her hear the Havdalah. Yeah. Meaning that was against
if it's a sheila of the community, rather than answer and comes to him, that's something. The idea of anybody going, okay, he's the Posek, but you should try and have your own.
No, it's a very interesting question. I do not feel that I have enough knowledge to give you an informed answer. From what I just, type of randomly seen, it seems to me that he was of the belief that if you have your own halachic opinion, then you are allowed to state it regardless of the local Rav. Now, again, obviously, always he would say, if it would cause a machloiket, then do not act. But as long as it's in your own home and regarding your own person, then he thought that you are allowed. There is a tshuva written to him by someone who made Aliyah, and he asked him, it was in the 50s, it was before the Chazon Ish was niftar, and he asked him, should I go to Bnei Brak? Because there are some things in which I do not do as the Chazon Ish, and he's the Rav of the city, and I'm worried that if I would go there, I would have to follow his own psokim. And Reb Moshe answered him, no, you don't have to follow his own. If you don't have an opinion, you should ask the Rav of the place, but if you have your own opinion, then you can follow your own opinion, and if you ask someone and he gave you a different psak, and you follow this specific Posek, then it seems to me that he thought that that's fine. Again, we differentiate between public sphere, in which things are different, and the personal sphere. But truth is, it's a very good question. It's a very good question. Maybe, again, his life as a community rabbi and then as a Rosh Yeshiva gave him some more multidimensional view on this question. Thank you. So he became a very famous rabbi in the United States, a very famous Posek. And the very old joke was that in order to become a Rav in the United States, what you needed to do is to have a hat and the phone number of Moshe Feinstein. And that's basically, I wonder what should I skip, because there is so much to speak about. He himself, by the way, in the introduction to the Igrot Moshe, he writes that he must answer as he sees. He says, a posek that was asked a question, if he is able to answer, he must answer. He's not allowed to defer it to someone else. Very interesting. B says that if you give an answer and you toiled, you worked hard to produce it, and you do it in Irat Shamayim with God-fearing, he says, even if it is wrong, if in heaven they know your answer is wrong, it is still the right answer to give. And that is lo b'shamayim. The Torah is not in heaven. Now, obviously, when you would understand that you made a mistake, then you should correct yourself. But as long as you worked hard and long on your answer, and that is the conclusion you came to, then this is the right answer. That's an interesting way of viewing things. And because of that, by the way, very interestingly, when there was people came to the United States with a trogim from Heter Mechira, Shmita Heter Mechira in Eretz Israel. And as you can understand, it was a halachic question, but even more than a halachic question, it was a political question, because the Chazon Ish was against the Heter Mechira. So basically, the Haredi institution was against Heter Mechira, and the more modern, where the Rabbanut in Eretz Israel was for Heter Mechira, and the more modern Orthodox were for Heter Mechira. And Moshe says, halachically, I hold that you should not rely on Heter Mechira. However, they have their own Rabbanim, and that's how the Rabbanim pass. And you cannot say that he's an Avarian because he is using, there is no problem, he said, for someone let's say he's a seller in a store. You are allowed to sell to him. Why? Because he believes it's mutar, so it's not lifnei iver. So there is no problem. You do not cause him to sin, because for him it's not a sin. That was his very interesting position, which made everyone angry with him. Right? Because the modern said, why you say it's halachic liasur? And the more Haredi said, if it is halachic liasur, then how do you not completely ban it? But Reb Moshe was very independent and also courageous in his opinions. And there were many these type of psakim. He made his best in order to enable people that got distanced from Torah and mitzvot in the United States to let them stay in the fold. That's very interesting. So people that were not so observant, he allowed them to get certain kibudim, even aliyah Torah, which is a very important psak that people use, we use. So given an aliyah Torah, even if someone is not halachically observant, and other psakim that were aimed and geared towards being mekarev the people. There is an answer of him that's the answer that we read earlier about chinuch. So he says to Rashi Yeshiva, you can receive to your yeshiva a student that comes from a non-observant home. However, if his mother does not allow him to wear tzitzit, then it depends. If she only doesn't allow him to wear tzitzit at home, you can still receive him. If she doesn't allow him to wear tzitzit at school, then it's already a damage to the other boys, and then you cannot accept him. That is very, I think, very far-reaching. And you can again think about some of the yeshivot nowadays. Is there any chance they would accept someone that his parents are non-observant, let alone that do not allow him to wear tzitzit at home, and put it as a condition in the interview, in the acceptance interview? So that's, on the other hand, regarding conservatives and reformers, he was very sharp. So while for someone that is non-observant, he would allow, again under certain conditions, but he would basically allow to be given aliyah Torah. There was a question that he was asked, there was a certain banquet for Eretz Israel. And it was joined by reforms and conservatives and Orthodox. And they wanted to give a kibud to the Reform rabbi. And they wanted, maybe you just say the hamoitzi on the bread. And Moshe says, no, because it does not really be mechaven for Hashem. It's Shem Shamayim Levatala. You cannot rely even on his birkat hamotzi. And so he almost completely excluded them. He says, if someone is teaching in a conservative institution, then he is not allowed to teach in our yeshivot, not even give a shiur at shul. So he was very sharp in drawing the distinctions. He believed in the 50s and the 60s, as the conservative movement was blooming, I think that he believed that's the only way to stop the collapse of Orthodox Judaism. Again, we spoke only about the tip of the iceberg. I would just, in the next 3 minutes, I'll just read a list. Artificial insemination. He was the first one to tackle. He was matir, and he received a lot of backlash on that. He was against bat mitzvah, but he allowed for a kiddush on the bat mitzvah. He didn't like the parties. And by the way, he said, I also am not a great fan of bar mitzvah. He said, I didn't see that it benefits so much the children. That's what he says, very interesting. He allowed adoption of non-Jewish children, being megayer them and then adopting them. As I said, joining people that are not observant to a minyan, putting American flag and Israeli flag in shul. Now, he was against, but he says, if it is in there, do not make a big machloket. It's not an issue. I don't think it should be there, but it's not a big machloket if they put it in. To call the number of the page in the Siddur during the tefillah. Now, that may seem simple to you, but that was something that was done by the reforms. So people were very worried from putting such a thing, and he said there's no problem, and it's not an hefsek, because it is needed for the sake of the tefillah. It is not considered as an hefsek. And of course, the company milks, the cream cheese, the mechitza, the height of the mechitza. There is so much. I have here a list of 14 things. Obviously, we cannot manage them all. We are only being given a taste of this great man, and I highly advise everyone that wants to get any deeper. There are some now very good shiurim over the internet, over on YouTube. You can just type in Igrot Moshe Responsa or Moshe Feinstein, and you can hear some very nice stories and also some very good analysis, at least of some of his tshuvot in the Igrot Moshe. I don't know if they made. I think he was against making an abridged and explained English version of the Igot Moshe. He opposed it. He said that the Igot Moshe is dedicated to people that are able to read. If you're not able to read, then it's not for you. I think that's what he said. However, he has these drashot books, Darash Moshe and Kol Ram, both beautiful drashot. And again, I advise everyone here to at least take a look on the legacy of this great giant. He was niftar in 1984 on Tanit Esther. A personal note, I was born 2 days later on Shushan Purim. So he was niftar on Tanit Esther in 1984, and they brought him to Kvua here in Eretz Israel. And that's a story in itself, but we are out of time. Thank you so much, and Be'ezrat Hashem, we will meet next week.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi. That's wonderful.
Thank you.
But I think part of his greatness was